You know those moments that just slip out? Words you can't take back, even when you see the damage they do? Yeah, this is about that. About how sometimes you say exactly what you're thinking without the filter, and suddenly, everything changes. I'm Lydia, 32, and this is about how I destroyed my marriage with 9 little words. Trust me, I didn't think they'd end everything. I just thought they'd finally motivate him to get his act together. Wyatt and I met 4 years ago when we were both on the rise. I was climbing the corporate ladder in sales, making good money, turning heads at company events. He was this confident guy running job sites, always telling me stories about solving impossible problems and managing difficult clients. That confidence was sexy as hell, you know? He'd walk into a room and command attention without even trying. We moved in together after 8 months, bought a starter home a year later. Everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't. About a year ago, his company started struggling. First came the layoffs. He survived 2 rounds before getting cut in the third. Just temporary, he said. I'll find something better. Between us, I believed him at first. He had connections, experience, all the right skills. But weeks turned into months, and suddenly I was covering all our bills while he sat around submitting applications and getting rejected. Each rejection chipped away at that confidence I'd found so attractive. He started questioning himself, second-guessing every decision. It was honestly pathetic to watch. I tried being supportive. I really did. I listened to him vent about interviews that went nowhere. I reviewed his resume. I even connected him with people in my network. But nothing stuck. And after a while, I started checking his phone when he was in the shower, just to see if he was actually applying for jobs or just saying he was. He'd get so defensive if I asked directly about his day or what he'd accomplished. Meanwhile, I put in long hours at work, picking up the slack financially, while he couldn't even remember the conversations we'd had about which bills were due when. You never told me the mortgage payment changed, he'd insist. When I know for a fact we discussed it over dinner last month. I would have remembered something that important. Are you seriously gaslighting me right now? I'd fire back. We literally talked about this for an hour. You even took notes on your phone. He'd get this confused look, checking his notes app, finding nothing. I think I'd remember that, Lydia. But that's the thing about Wyatt. His memory has always been selective, convenient, especially lately. I've started recording our important conversations on my phone just to prove I'm not crazy. Not that I let him know that. It's just insurance. The financial stress was the worst part. I'd come home to discover he'd ordered takeout again when we had perfectly good food in the fridge. Or he'd mention casually that he had to buy a new shirt for an interview. Small things that added up, when every dollar mattered. Every time I brought it up, he'd make me feel like the bad guy for keeping score. Meanwhile, I had Brandon at work. Not like that. Not exactly, anyway. Brandon's just someone who gets it. Someone who appreciates ambition and hard work. Someone who actually listens when I talk about my day instead of making everything about his problems. We text sometimes after hours, grab lunch occasionally. Wyatt once saw a notification from him and had the nerve to question me about it. The jealousy was ridiculous, considering I've never given him any reason not to trust me. Meanwhile, I don't say a word about that girl from his old job who's always checking in on him. The real breaking point came during dinner with my friends Caitlin and Marcus last month. They were talking about their upcoming vacation to Cabo, and Wyatt had to make it weird by mentioning how we'd had to cancel our anniversary trip because of the current situation. As if everyone doesn't already know he can't hold down a job. I was so embarrassed I could barely look at them. Later, when Caitlin texted to ask if we were okay, I found myself writing a whole paragraph about how I'm standing by my man during a tough time. Gagged me. But that's what good wives say, right? When we got home that night, he tried to talk about how I'd been snippy with him all evening. Classic Wyatt move. Create a problem, then act wounded when there are consequences. I couldn't deal with another conversation about his feelings, so I told him about my childhood piano recital disaster. The one where my mom didn't show up and my dad fell asleep. Works every time. He immediately switched to comfort mode, and suddenly his issues were forgotten. I've got a whole arsenal of personal traumas I can deploy when needed. Is that manipulative? Maybe. But sometimes it's the only way to get a moment's peace. So when it happened, when I finally said what I'd been thinking for months, I didn't even feel bad at first. We were fighting about money again. He'd had another failed interview and was doing his usual self-pity routine at the kitchen table. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he said, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers. "I feel like such a failure." And something in me just snapped. "Then why should I treat you like anything else?" I said it calmly, not even raising my voice. That's what seemed to hit him hardest. How matter-of-fact I was. The look on his face? I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes, like I'd physically struck him. Like the last person he expected to hurt him had just twisted the knife. He didn't say anything, just got up and walked out of the kitchen. I heard the spare room door close. I didn't apologize. Why should I? Sometimes the truth hurts. Sometimes people need to hear it to finally make a change. That's what I told myself as I went to bed alone that night. That's what I kept telling myself as the silence between us stretched from hours into days. I had no idea those 9 words would completely upend my life. No idea that sometimes you don't get to take things back. No idea that I'd just lit a fuse that would eventually blow up everything. The morning after our fight, I expected the usual routine. Wyatt would mope around, I'd ignore it, eventually he'd apologize, and things would go back to normal. That's how it always worked. But when I woke up, something was different. The apartment was silent. His keys were gone from the hook by the door, but his phone was still charging on the nightstand. Weird. I made coffee and waited. By noon, I was annoyed enough to text him. No response. I called, straight to voicemail. By evening, I was legitimately worried, so I started calling around. His friend Jake hadn't heard from him. His sister didn't pick up. When I checked our bank account online, I saw he'd withdrawn $200 from an ATM at 6 a.m. Nothing since. Great, I muttered to my empty apartment. Another mess I'll have to clean up. He finally showed up 2 days later, looking remarkably put together for someone who had essentially gone AWOL. Clean-shaven, new haircut, wearing a shirt I'd never seen before. "Where have you been?" I demanded, torn between relief and fury. "I was about to file a missing person report." "I needed some time to think," he said, maddeningly calm. "I stayed at a motel." "A motel? With what money?" I could feel my blood pressure rising. "We can barely make rent, and you're blowing cash on motels?" "My money," he said simply, "from my personal account." I froze. What personal account? That's when I learned Wyatt had been keeping a separate savings account I knew nothing about. Apparently he'd been putting aside small amounts from every paycheck since before we met. "Just in case," he said. The hypocrisy was unbelievable. I'd been carrying us financially for months, and he's been hiding money? When I pointed this out, instead of apologizing, he had the nerve to say, "Now you know how it feels when someone isn't transparent." That's when I realized he knew. About the texts, about Brandon. He'd found something on my phone. "You went through my messages?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "No," he said, watching me carefully. "But thanks for confirming what I suspected." Classic interrogation trick. God, I wanted to slap him. Instead, I found myself doing damage control, explaining that Brandon was just a work friend, that Wyatt was blowing things out of proportion, that his insecurity was creating problems where none existed. All the while, I was mentally cataloging my conversations with Brandon, trying to remember if I'd said anything truly incriminating. Over the next few weeks, Wyatt became a different person. He still couldn't find a job, but instead of wallowing, he developed this infuriating indifference. He'd leave early in the morning and return late, offering vague explanations about networking and building connections. Whenever I pressed for details, he'd give me these empty corporate phrases that told me nothing. Meanwhile, I started bringing up his supposed anger issues around our friends. Nothing dramatic, just casual mentions of how he'd exploded over minor things, how I had to walk on eggshells sometimes. If anyone asked Wyatt about it, he'd deny everything so calmly that it actually made my claims more believable. Who stays that composed when they're being accused unless they're hiding something? The worst part was how he stopped reacting to my criticisms. I'd point out how his inability to find work was affecting us, how his new attitude wasn't helping anything, how he needed to try harder, and he'd just nod politely, like I was a stranger making small talk about the weather. I found myself pushing harder, saying more cutting things, deliberately bringing up his deepest insecurities just to get a reaction. Nothing worked. "What is wrong with you?" I finally exploded one night after getting nothing but bland responses to some very reasonable questions about where he'd been all day. "It's like you don't even care anymore." He looked at me for a long moment. "I care about different things now." That's when it clicked. Wyatt wasn't depressed anymore. He wasn't defeated. He wasn't even looking for my approval. Somehow, my words had broken something in him. Not in the way I'd intended. I'd broken whatever part of him still cared what I thought. A week later, I came home to find Wyatt sitting at our dining room table with his laptop open and a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of him. "Financial records," he said without looking up. "Bank statements, credit card bills, receipts, from the past year." My stomach dropped. "Why are you going through that stuff?" "Because I've been trying to figure out where all our money went." He finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Since, according to you, I'm the reason we're struggling." He'd created a spreadsheet tracking our expenses for the past 12 months. My expenses, specifically. The $400 hair appointment I'd claimed was just a trim. The designer bag I'd told him was on sale for a tenth of what I actually paid. The work dinners that were actually nights out with my friends when I told him I was working late. All laid out in meticulous detail. "You've spent over $20,000 on non-essentials this year," he said quietly. "While I've been applying for jobs I'm overqualified for because you said we needed the money desperately." Before I could respond, he slid his phone across the table, opened to screenshots of texts between me and Brandon. Not just any texts, the ones where I'd complained about Wyatt, called him pathetic, laughed about his failed interviews. The most damning ones from a night when Brandon had suggested I'd be better off without Wyatt, and I'd replied, "Working on it." Brandon's girlfriend Amy found these and thought I should know, Wyatt said before I could accuse him of snooping. "Apparently, he's been showing your texts around the office." The humiliation was like a physical blow. Brandon had been sharing our conversations. People at my company had seen them. "Those are private," I managed to say, "and completely out of context." "There's no context where this is okay, Lydia." For the first time in weeks, I heard real emotion in his voice. "Do you have any idea what it's like to learn that the person who's supposed to have your back has been actively undermining you, making you feel crazy for suspecting something was wrong?" "Oh, please," I scoffed. "Don't act like you're some innocent victim here. You've been lying about money, disappearing for days, keeping secrets." "I started the separate account when you maxed out our credit cards without telling me," he interrupted. "When you kept forgetting we'd discussed major purchases. When you made me feel insane for questioning expenses I never agreed to. And I've been disappearing because I've been working with a therapist," he continued. "Trying to understand how I let myself get to this point. How I convinced myself that your constant criticism was somehow helpful. So what? Now you're some enlightened guy?" I said, going for the jugular. "Still unemployed, still living off me, still a complete failure. But now you've got a therapist to validate your feelings? Congratulations." I expected him to crumble. Instead, he just gathered his papers calmly. "I have a job, Lydia. I've had one for 3 weeks. I start Monday." The shock must have shown on my face. "You didn't notice because you never ask about my day anymore, unless it's to criticize," he said, standing up. "And you're right. I have been a failure. I failed to set boundaries. I failed to recognize emotional abuse when it was happening to me. I failed to leave when I should have." "Emotional abuse?" I laughed incredulously. "You're ridiculous. I've done nothing but support you." "You should talk to someone," he said, and his pity was worse than anger would have been. "This pattern will follow you to your next relationship if you don't address it." "Next relationship?" My voice sounded strange, distant. "What are you talking about?" He gestured to another stack of papers I hadn't noticed. "Rental agreement forms. I've signed a lease. I'm moving out this weekend. I'm filing for divorce." In that moment, something in me broke. The careful facade I'd maintained, the story I'd been telling myself, it all came crashing down. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes as I started screaming, calling him every name I could think of, threatening to destroy his reputation, his friendships, his new job prospects. I told him no one would ever believe his version of events, that I'd make sure everyone knew what a mentally unstable liar he was. I didn't recognize myself, and from the look on his face, neither did he. The next day, Wyatt moved out while I was at work. No dramatic confrontation, no tearful goodbye, just empty dresser drawers and missing photos when I got home. He'd left his key on the kitchen counter along with divorce documents already filled out with his information. That night, I alternated between rage and disbelief, calling and texting him nonstop. He didn't respond. I drove by Jake's apartment, certain that's where he'd be staying, but his car wasn't there. His sister answered my call only to tell me that Wyatt didn't want to speak to me and that I should respect that. Monday morning, I woke up determined to fix this misunderstanding. Clearly, Wyatt was having some kind of breakdown. The stress had finally broken him, and he was lashing out. He'd come crawling back, and maybe I'd let him, after he'd groveled sufficiently. I put on my best outfit and headed to work confidently. Everything would be fine. The universe wouldn't let someone like me end up alone. That confidence lasted exactly 45 minutes. I'd barely settled at my desk when my supervisor Monica asked to see me in the conference room. Inside was our HR director, looking solemn. "We've received some concerning reports," Monica began, gesturing for me to sit. "About your conduct with colleagues." My mind immediately went to Brandon. Had he complained about me somehow? "Several staff members have come forward with screenshots of conversations where you disparage clients and colleagues," Monica continued, including some extremely inappropriate comments about me personally. The texts to Brandon. "You must have shown them to HR. That's private communication," I protested. "Completely out of context." "These weren't obtained from your devices," the HR director clarified. "They were voluntarily provided by recipients of your messages. And there are quite a lot of them, from multiple sources." They placed a folder in front of me. Inside were dozens of printed screenshots, not just conversations with Brandon, but with other colleagues too. Messages where I'd mocked clients after difficult calls, where I'd made crude jokes about coworkers, where I'd bragged about manipulating metrics to boost my performance. Everything I'd ever sent, assuming it was private. "This constitutes a clear violation of our code of conduct," Monica said, not hiding her disgust. "We're placing you on administrative leave while we complete our investigation, but I'll be honest, this is grounds for immediate termination." I had to surrender my laptop and badge immediately. Security would escort me to my desk to collect personal items, then off the premises. "Who did this?" I finally managed to ask. "Was it Brandon?" Monica's expression tightened. "This wasn't just one person, Lydia. Apparently, a lot of people have been keeping receipts." The humiliation of that walkout. Past colleagues who suddenly found their computer screens fascinating, who whispered behind their hands as security flanked me, was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My carefully constructed professional image shattered in an instant. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and screamed. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. I was the successful one, the one with everything together. Then it hit me, Wyatt. This had to be his doing. He must have contacted Brandon, convinced him to turn against me. That was the only explanation that made sense. I drove to his new office, a modern building downtown. The receptionist smiled politely when I asked for him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wells is in meetings all day. Would you like to leave a message?" "Mr. Wells?" Like he was someone important. "Tell him his wife is here," I snapped. Her expression changed slightly. "Oh, I see. One moment, please." After a quick call, her professional smile returned, but colder. "I'm afraid Mr. Wells isn't available. He's asked that all communication go through his attorney." By the time I got home, I had a voicemail from HR saying they'd decided to terminate my employment effective immediately. 4 years at that company, gone in an afternoon. The next morning, a lawyer called about divorce proceedings. Everything moved with dizzying speed after that. Wyatt's lawyer was ruthlessly efficient, presenting documentation of everything. The financial discrepancies, the emotional abuse, my infidelity. Apparently Brandon had been more than just texts. There were hotel receipts. My tampering with Wyatt's job applications, forwarding his emails to myself and accidentally deleting interview requests. I hadn't realized he knew about that. I'd told myself I was protecting him from jobs that weren't good enough. But seeing it laid out, it looked deliberate, malicious even. My lawyer advised me to settle quickly. "They have a strong case," she said bluntly. "If this goes to court, you could lose much more." What they were asking for felt outrageous. The house would be sold, with proceeds split after Wyatt was reimbursed for his stolen opportunity costs. My retirement account would be divided, with an additional percentage going to him as compensation for the credit card debt I'd hidden. They even wanted me to cover his therapy costs. "This is highway robbery," I fumed. "I supported him for months." My lawyer sighed. "Lydia, they have evidence that you deliberately sabotaged his employment opportunities while simultaneously spending joint funds on luxury items and an affair. The judge will not be sympathetic." I fired her that day. Found a more aggressive attorney who promised to fight. It was a mistake that cost me thousands in additional legal fees, only to end up agreeing to basically the same settlement 3 months later. During those months, my life continued to unravel. Friends stopped returning my calls after Wyatt apparently shared some of our greatest hits with them. I was uninvited from Caitlin's baby shower. My parents suggested I seek professional help for my issues. Even my sister took his side. "You've always been like this," she told me, "but this time you picked the wrong person to mess with." By the time the divorce was finalized 6 months later, I was essentially starting from scratch. New apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. New job with a significant pay cut. New identity, as that crazy ex people whispered about. Meanwhile, Wyatt was thriving. I heard through mutual connections that he'd been promoted already. That he'd bought a nice condo. That he was dating someone. A therapist who specialized in helping people recover from narcissistic relationships. Yesterday, I saw them together at a coffee shop. Wyatt looked different. Confident in a quiet way, laughing at something his girlfriend said. When he spotted me, there was no dramatic reaction. Just a small nod of acknowledgement before returning his attention to the woman across from him. Like I was barely worth noting. That's when it truly hit me. I had become nothing to him. All the power I thought I had, all the ways I'd defined his reality and controlled our narrative. Gone. He'd moved on completely, while I was still trying to understand how I'd lost everything. I'd like to say this story ends with me having some profound realization, that I've seen the error of my ways and am working to become a better person. But the truth is, I'm still angry. Still convinced that everyone overreacted, that Wyatt somehow manipulated the situation to turn people against me. That none of this is really my fault. And yet, sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear my own voice saying those 9 words that changed everything. Then why should I treat you like anything else? And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, I've been the villain in this story all along. But acknowledging that would mean accepting responsibility for everything that's happened. And I'm not ready to do that. I'm not sure I ever will be.